Now, I want to tell you about something that happened Friday night when I was walking into another room in my house. My wife blurted out, "Here's one. It is in accepting our limitations that we can go beyond them." I have to tell you that she was reading her Facebook page and this is one of those pithy quotes that somebody had posted up there for their friends in the world to see. And as she does sometimes, she wants to share those with me. And I thought, accepting limitations is how we overcome them? I don't think I'm buying that. So if the person who finally ran a 4-minute mile back when people didn't think it was humanly possible to do it, if he would have accepted that limitation, he probably wouldn't have broken through it. But after he did, many others did after him and do to this day, and we realized that it wasn't really a human limitation, it was a psychological limitation. If we had accepted the limitation that 2-legged, hairy, wingless animals cannot fly, we might have never invented the airplane or gone to the moon. As you can tell, I was just not buying this little nugget of internet profundity. In fact, I was rebelling against it as much as I could, but it would not let me go. I wondered, just because something is not true all of the time, does that mean it's not true any of the time? Could accepting our limitations ever lead us to transcend them? This riddle led me all the way to heaven and back. Now, in many ways, our common ideas about heaven in this culture are a denial of the limits of human life. Heaven is typically seen as a place where time and joy and fulfillment of our desires is endless. The limits of earth don't apply. Now, as one of my colleagues explains, it's human nature to be dissatisfied with what we have. Our work, our looks, our health, our sex lives, the length of our vacations, the size of our homes, the way we live our lives. Everywhere we end up running into limits. Often we cannot do what we dreamed of doing, have what we fantasize having, be who we wish to be. And there is never enough time. But heaven, it seems, is where our desires will be fulfilled without bounds. Like author Kathleen Norris, I find myself attracted to this traditional image of the utter democracy of the heavenly feast. Everyone is invited, and everyone who thirsts will drink, and anyone who hungers will eat, and no one will be sick or disabled or even unhappy. And money will not be needed to have the best of everything. Yet even though this image is so compelling, I find myself thinking, isn't this idea of immortality just a trick that people play on themselves to make them feel better about the losses and the limitations of our lives down here on earth? Was Karl Marx right that religion is an opiate of the masses, a way to distract people from the injustices of their lives and this world so that they will put up with the status quo that favors a few at the expense of the many? Is such religion simply a way to trick the poor into accepting their poverty because they can convince themselves that this world is not what matters, but if they are good and obedient, then they will be rewarded in the next life? Even if this is true of religion some of the time, it's certainly not true of religion all of the time. But before I begin to say what I have said so many times from this pulpit in this church, that heaven is here on earth, that it is now and in this world, and that there is a piece of heaven within each of us. But before I go there, Today I find myself thrown back on my heels by these words by Eric Thones, the chair of Biblical and Theological Studies at Biola University outside of Los Angeles, that were included in a recent article, you might have seen it, in Time magazine on Rethinking Heaven. In it, he was responding to the way that so many Christian biblical scholars today are writing about the way that the old idea of a future heaven after death is not actually in the Bible, and that they are beginning to preach and teach that Jesus' message and the Bible are really about heaven being made here on earth, as it is in heaven on earth. In response to the professor, he wrote, "So much of the emphasis that says, let's get away from this overly future-oriented idea of heaven and the afterlife and focus on now, tends to come from," and here it comes, "white dudes wearing skinny jeans who live in the suburbs. And not poor, suffering people." And I wondered if you'd been watching me on a spy cam or something. Because it's close enough. He goes on to say, just listen to some Negro spirituals, and you will get a massive dose of future orientation, because they did not have the option of thinking that we would have heaven here on earth, or that heaven is just an ethical heart within us. For the slaves who created the spirituals, heaven was a glorious afterlife, a real place that they would enter someday that was free of the chains and the miseries of this world. In fact, one of the reasons that Universalist theology has never historically been very popular among African Americans is that Universalist theology traditionally is premised on the idea that there is no hell, that God wins, that everyone will eventually be saved, which is translated as everyone will go to heaven. Well, no slaves or former slaves, as I understand it, wanted anything to do with a heaven which would include the white masters and overseers who whipped their mothers and fathers, or who coldly sold their children and spouses away from them. A religion that says the likes of slave masters and grand wizards of the Ku Klux Klan will be in heaven has always been a hard sell to the oppressed. But a religion that says this world is mixed up, unjust, and upside down, and the good news is that it is only a finite existence. In the end, you will be free and honored and know yourself as the beautiful child of God that you are. It will be a world with no segregation, no subjugation, no want, but streets of plenty, where the whole family will be together and everyone will have a smile and a place at the table. That was not only appealing, it was life-saving. There was the idea that death may be inevitable and even gruesome, but never triumphant. So the spirituals are filled with otherworldly orientation. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child a long way from home. Soon I will be done with the troubles of this world, going home to live with God. And I haven't been to heaven, but I've been told the streets are pearl and the gates are gold, not made with hands. It was going to be a place where the slaves were finally counted in. I got a robe, you got a robe, all God's children got robes. When we get to heaven, we're going to put on our robes, we're going to shout all over God's heaven. This would be a place of freedom and pleasure and dignity, where family ties were restored, and most of all, a person had an identity all his or her own. So for the slaves, and the generations to come. And we were all enslaved by that whole system, but you understand what I mean. For the slaves and the generations to come, there was a sense that this world was temporary and the next world was here to stay. Or in the words of the spiritual, our ship is on the ocean, but we'll anchor by and by. The question remains, was that simply an illusion? A crutch? Maybe a necessary and even an understandable crutch that made chattel slavery bearable, yet still an opiate? A fantasy that kept people in their place? Or was it one of the most significant theological breakthroughs of our modern world? I'm going to answer that question in just a minute, but first, I want to go back to this idea of heaven as a denial of limitations. You may have read in my sermon description that I printed in the newsletter that on occasion I've found myself at the bedside of somebody who was dying in a matter of hours or days. And I'll ask them, when you make it to the other side, if you see my little girl, Sienna, who died back in 2006, will you give her a hug for me and tell her that her mother and her brother and I are doing all right and that we love her? And every one of them, even the Unitarians, said yes. Most of us have a hard time imagining such a heaven, but we certainly wouldn't mind being surprised and finding out that we're wrong. Or would we? Let's think about it for a second. The idea of an eternal life without end. It sounds great at first, but when you think about it, it may not be that heavenly. Forrest Church, one of my colleagues, in his book Entertaining Angels, he reminded me of Mark Twain's character, Captain Stormfield, who finds himself at the pearly gates and he decides that St. Peter is not really very competent. Stormfield had been in church for decades, and he was surprised that St. Peter didn't even know what he was supposed to do. In the dialogue, Stormfield looks at St. Peter and he says, I beg your pardon, and you mustn't mind my reminding and seeming to meddle, but ain't you forgot something? Forgot something? Peter shakes his head, no, not that I know of. Stormfield is incredulous. Think, he says. Peter thinks, but he has to admit, no, I can't seem to have forgot anything. Look at me, Captain Stormfield complains. Look at me all over. Peter looks. Well, he says. Well, Stormfield cries, you don't notice anything? If I'm branched out among the elect, looking like this, wouldn't I attract considerable attention? Wouldn't I be a little conspicuous? Peter is nonplussed. I don't see anything the matter. What do you lack? Lack? Why, I lack my harp and my wreath and my halo and my hymn book and my palm branch. Captain Stormfield is astonished that St. Peter has been up here all this time and he doesn't even seem to know what he's doing, which caused Forrest Church to say, that's the problem with heaven. We know more about it than the angels do. Vacation forever, Sundays, 7 days a week, everyone in uniform, harps, hymnals, and halos commissioned upon arrival, not to mention wings. In Mark Twain's story, St. Peter eventually gives in and gives Stormfield what he wants because, the line's backing up and in the pearly gates and he figures he needs to get him through. The captain dons his angel apparel and he settles down on a cloud with about 1 million other angels. He gives his palm branch a wave for good measure and he begins playing the one song he knows how to play on the harp over and over again. After about 17 hours of this, One of the wingless, haloless angels sitting nearby says, "Don't you know any other tune than the one you've been pegging all day?" "Not another blessed one," says he. "Don't you reckon you could learn another one?" "Never. I've tried to, but couldn't manage it." His companion shakes his haloless head. It's a long time to hang to the one. Eternity, you know. To which Stormfield replies, "Don't break my heart. I'm getting low-spirited enough already." A while later, the veteran angel asks, "Are you glad to be here?" Captain Stormfield answers, "I'll be frank with you. This ain't just as near my idea of bliss as I thought it was when I used to go to church." Let's be honest. Eternity of anything would probably become an incredible bore. Remember, what gives things value and makes things precious is their scarcity. You know, someone said if gold grew on trees and apples were buried deep in the earth, we would measure our wealth in apples. It's the scarcity that makes things valuable. Our time with our children and our parents are precious because they will not be with us forever. Time itself is so priceless because there never seems to be enough of it. It is precisely the scarcity of things that makes them valuable and special. Reverend Church says, life without end is not what it's cracked up to be. It is precisely the opposite. It's not heaven, it's hell. A poem I have read from time to time at memorial services of someone who's died says, "Death is not too high a price to pay for having lived. Mountains never die, nor do the seas or rocks or endless sky. Through countless centuries of time they stay, eternal, deathless, yet they never live. If choice were there, I would not hesitate to choose mortality, whatever fate demanded in return for life I'd give. For never to have seen the fertile plains, nor heard the winds, nor felt the warm sun on sands beneath the salty sea, not touched the hands of those I love. Without these, all the gains of timelessness would not be worth one day of living and of loving, come what may." Limits are what give our lives value and beauty. And accepting these limits helps us appreciate the time that we have with each other. And instead of seeking our immortality in another life, we can be inspired to try to leave an indelible mark, a legacy in this life. I think it's a great sign, in fact, that so many Christian scholars and ministers are focusing on the biblical injunction that says we need to work to create heaven here on earth. The eternal pie in the sky, sweet by and by heaven is really the creation of painters and poets and preachers. And of course, it has played a major role in the religion of the oppressed in this country and all over the world. But if we really believe that heaven is meant to be experienced here on earth, what does that theology say to the former slaves and the people who are living in desperate conditions around the world today? Because any theology that can't speak to those people is not a theology worth having at all. Are we left smugly patting them on the head that their view is simplistic and we understand why, and our view is so much more advanced and relevant? Or is there a connection between this idea that we need to create heaven here on earth and the theological perspective that was left to us in the spirituals? It was a profound and life-saving theology in those spirituals and still is. And it was a faith that helped them and helps us still, and people all across the globe, to transcend the injustice and the cruelty of their lives. Now, here's how the idea in the afterlife connects with the idea of heaven here on earth. Imagine a slave for a moment, being denied his humanity, being treated like property, who has a belief that in this world is upside down, but in God's world, he will be respected for who he is. He will have his dignity and his freedom. In the moment of his believing in that heaven, or singing about its coming, in that moment, he is infused with a sense of his dignity and his humanity and his nobility. He knows who he really is, despite all that the powers around him are saying. In that moment of affirmation, when the idea of the future heaven takes hold, in that very moment it's changed. He's changed. Has a sense of himself intact and irrefutable. In that moment, with that theology, he has transcended the subjugation of his life, and he has tapped into his holiness and his wholeness. He no longer sees himself the way that the upside down world sees him. He sees his eternal essence. The belief itself brings to earth the ways of heaven. The belief itself redeems his humanity and his dignity in an otherwise unredeemable situation. For sure, this belief can at times be an opiate, providing hope and expectation that allows a person just to transcend that current moment, but to remain resigned to it. It can be a belief that can serve to help a person just get up and do what needs to be done for another day without making waves. But it can also be, and has been, the critical factor that has helped a person and a people transmit a sense of their essential dignity and worth, and give them a will and the power to rise up and change the world right here on earth. To give them the drive, to quote the Lord's Prayer, to work to make things here on earth as they are in heaven. In that sense, this belief is not an opiate or a fantasy, helping people to be complicit with the status quo, but helping them to reject it and to transform it. Sure, such religion can be an opiate, but just because something is true some of the time does not mean that it is true all of the time. The Bible teaches of an earth redeemed, and it invites us to take part in making it so. That's the future orientation of a place where everyone belongs, where everyone's equal, where there's no more subjugation and demeaning of people because of who they love or because of what they look like or where they live or how much money they have or don't have. That's the future orientation. It's meant to be created here by us, by our lives, to bring that ideal into this world. I've come to really think of eternity not as a length of time as much as a quality of time. It is a quality of time that we can experience in any moment. The moments of those slaves that I mentioned, singing those spirituals and feeling their true place in existence, those were eternal moments. Eternal moments are like those moments when we take time to sit in the living room and hear the stories of our grandmother, our grandfather, and our mothers and our fathers. Or when a child reaches out to hold your hand because she can tell that you don't feel very well. Those are eternal moments. Or when our life, our crazy life, our routine gets upended because we see somebody on the side of the road and we decide to stop to help, not expecting anything in return. Eternal moments. My wife and I, we have a daughter who was born in 2008. You can bet I stop whatever I'm doing when she comes in to show me her latest drawing or to tell me about her day, incomprehensible as it can sometimes be. Having lost a child, I realize now more than ever that these moments are eternal. They can never be taken away from her or from me. And I remember how I used to get so upset when one of the kids would be sick or have a nightmare and I'd have to get out of bed and tromp on over to their room. Well, it's different now. I feel blessed to have them to care for, because these are the moments that last. These are the eternal moments, the legacy that we leave. Does this mean that I have completely given up on any idea of an afterlife? All I know is that the consciousness that we have, where does it go after we die, is a complete mystery, and nobody knows. And there's only one way to find out. And let me just say, I can wait to find out. But I'm smart enough to be agnostic on that matter. Let me just say that there still will be times when on occasion I'll be sitting with somebody who's dying and I'll reach over and I'll take their hand and I'll say, when you get to the other side, if you see my little girl, would you just give her a hug for me? And I would be thrilled beyond all imagination to find out that I would have some time to see her again and be with her again. But in the meantime, I'm not counting on it. And I'm living my life in ways that I can remember her here and try to bring her alive in this life, in this time, so to speak. Actually, I just did today to you, if her story had any influence on your life. There's a project that my brother and my dad started after she died. Really neat project. Great way for the two of them. They've bonded. My brother's gotten involved, making a difference. He lives in Guatemala, and the two of them started building schools for Mayan Indian children, the indigenous people there who are often very poor and live in very rural areas and don't have many schools. They started building schools. It's called the Sienna Project in her name, and they build schools. They just got back last month from building a school for disabled Mayan children. There's only 3 schools for disabled Mayan kids in the whole country of over 5 million Mayans. And what they found out while they were down there was that these kids often will die very young because the family doesn't take care of them in the same. When you don't have enough food for everybody, that's the child that you don't feed as well. It's a burden. You know that they're not going to be able to work probably in many cases. So those kids tend to die young. So what they know that they did in her name was they're saving some children's lives. Her love and her legacy live on, and her life touches people to this day and will for generations to come. And that's beautiful. How will you live on after you're gone? Will you continue to support the things that you worked for in your life after your death? I mean, if you fought against fear and ignorance, as we do all the time in this church, if you worked against injustice of different kinds, will you remain a part of the team after your body is no longer here? Have you considered how you will transcend death in this world through your gifts, through your influence, through your inspiration and love? Remember that we won't always be here to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth, but our job while we are here is to keep pushing and nudging and kind of moving the project forward for the generations to come. That's what people have been doing for generations and centuries, and it's our turn, and we're going to do it, and we are doing it. And we got to keep on doing it and finding ways. Because this acknowledging this limit is one of the ways that we can surpass it, as the quote said. May you acknowledge the limitations of your time on earth so that you can transcend them with your love and your influence beyond all measure. Heaven knows The world needs more people who think like that. Amen. I love you.